Okay, today I want to explore a common paradox in productivity psychology, which is burnout versus growth. And which of these things are you doing when you're pushing yourself beyond your limits? And conventional wisdom has, I feel like, failed me in my own life, not because it's bad, but because I don't feel like it sufficiently gives me a mental model to know when to push and when to pull back. And that conventional wisdom often frames that idea of pushing yourself beyond established limits as this binary proposition that you're either growing or you're burning out. And whenever I explain people, like to people in my life, that they say, what do you got going on? What are you doing this weekend? And I explain, I'm working. And they're like, you were working last weekend. Yeah, and I was working the weekend before that. And they say something like, well, that feels really unsustainable. And it's like, well, I don't know what that means, right? Because my life dictates that I'm doing this right now according to my values system. And it's very important not to let other people's advice be the exclusive frame. So if 10 out of 10 people in your life are telling you you're working too much, that does not mean you're working too much. And that doesn't even mean you need to give credence to that. It might just mean 10 out of 10 people in your life don't understand your personal value system. And you have to be the one to determine that for yourself in your mind, which requires a lot of internal fortitude and strength. And a lot of the advice that you get around burnout is stop working. You need to rest because it's the safe advice. I have a whole series I'm going to do on advice. But the advice that people give you is not necessarily the advice that they would follow or the advice that they think is best in this situation. The advice people tend to give about work and about emotional health and about burnout is advice that feels the safest and feels like it carries the lowest liability for them, and advice that feels like it's going to come back and bite them the least, right? So people don't give advice that's best. People give advice that feels safest to give. And that's the advice you're getting. And that's what determines usually the inputs you're getting from other people, not necessarily what you should do or what might even be best for you. So this framing of conventional wisdom about burnout versus growth, right? This framing really just like oversimplifies a profoundly nuanced reality. And to fully grasp what's happening when we consciously operate at the edge of our capabilities, at the edge of our resources, at the limit of our exhaustion, is that we have to turn to a more complex tool, which is a tool that I like to call existential risk. So, what is existential risk? Existential risk comes from philosopher Karl Jaspers. And he introduces this concept of limit situations. These are experiences, limit situations are experiences that force individuals to confront fundamental aspects of their existence. These are moments that are characterized by struggle and suffering and unavoidable limits. And according to Jaspers, encountering these boundary conditions compels individuals to either reconstruct their identity or retreat to safety. And operating beyond perceived limits deliberately invokes these limit situations. And the conscious decision to continually test one's capacities is, in essence, an existential wager. This is the decision to create a limit condition for oneself or a limit situation for oneself. This is an implicit bet on my own resilience and my own stability, and the strength and the perseverance of my psychological core. This wager comes with compelling rewards too, but it comes with substantial risks. So I want to look at a more, really a deeper philosophical framing of this, because it's very common to deal with these issues of psychology and mind and self from a psychological point of view, rather than a philosophical point of view. Modern therapeutic positivistic culture will have us try to deal with things with these these things that feel like soft categories for us, like burnout and mental health, with terms that are empirically derived or sound scientific, rather than things that feel philosophical or sophistic or mystical. And so, but I think it's important to think philosophically about these things. So when we look at this question of liminality and self-limitation, where do we go? Well, I think we can go to the existentialists to learn about existential risk. And really, I would call him the grandfather of existentialism is Hegel. So let's go there. So implicit in this very notion of kind of pushing beyond your limits, there's this dialectical tension explored by philosophers like Hegel in his Phenomenology of the Spirit, or later in Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness. This is the simultaneous need for limits and limitations to define selfhood, and the necessity to transcend these limits for authentic self-creation. And Hegel, he emphasized that self-consciousness emerges precisely in relation to limits, that self-consciousness requires friction and boundary and negation. And the self defines itself not in seamless expansion, but in a continual dynamic confrontation with what resists the self. And to remove all limits is paradoxically to erase the conditions necessary for meaningful identity transformation. And so the act of pushing beyond limits can only maintain its meaning as long as limits themselves persist in some recognizable form. So Sartre echoes a similar dynamic, though he kind of frames it existentially. And in his view, in Sartre's view, human consciousness is perpetually trapped between facticity, which is the given circumstances of existence, and transcendence, which is the radical capacity to project oneself beyond those circumstances. And the experience of growth is inherently tied to the tension between facticity and transcendence. To pursue transcendence without acknowledging facticity is not liberation. It's a form of bad faith in denying the fundamental embeddedness of human existence. This is when somebody goes into God mode and has a Messiah complex and has unbelievable belief in themselves to the point that they're, you might even call it having grandiose delusions. And sometimes those kinds of wagers work out, but typically not. So you want a kind of ambition and drive and push that does challenge your limits, but engages with them meaningfully, but doesn't discard them entirely to the point where you do start having these grandiose delusions. On the other hand, to resign oneself, in Sartre's view, entirely to facticity is to abdicate the existential responsibility of freedom. So if you say, I like my life, it's balanced, I'm not pushing myself in any way, and I'm really not doing anything that engages with my limits at all right now. The boundary is way over there, and I'm happy for it to be way over there. Right? And I'm not saying that you shouldn't ever be in that place. What I'm saying, and what the existentialists give us a framework for, is saying that the really fulfilling and satisfying and the discovery of meaningful dynamics in human life comes from engaging with limitations as much as we can and watching those boundaries shift. And then we find ourselves in areas of comfort again, and then residing there and recharging and gaining the resources we can from there, and then pushing back again, right? So there is this pattern of engaging with limits, pushing with limits, pursuing the transcendent beyond what we believe we're capable of, and pushing ourselves to that place, watching the boundaries reorganize themselves around our decisiveness and willpower, and then being in a comfort zone again and having that be okay too, and then re-engaging limits. So applying this dialectical perspective philosophically, it clarifies what is often oversimplified in popular self-improvement discourse. So genuine growth isn't merely going beyond your limits, and nor is it about passively accepting them. It resides in consciously navigating the ongoing negotiation between identity-defining limitations and the human imperative to overcome those identity-defining limitations. So now let's move into a discussion of why high performers accept existential risk. So the act of pushing yourself, beyond comfortable limits is not merely about performance metrics or superficial allure of achievement or anything like that. It's about, it represents a psychological calculus where deeper and subtler rewards drive behavior. So you accept existential risk because it gives you some things. Existential risk gives you a strengthening of self-belief. Success is uncertain, and boundary testing situations significantly bolster your self-concept. It provides you tangible proof of resilience and adaptability. So engaging in existential risk, it strengthens your self-belief. It also leads to the discovery of uncharted capabilities inside you. Confronting the unknown allows individuals to uncover latent strengths and skills and internal resources previously unrecognized or underdeveloped. And then finally, engaging in existential risk provides intellectual and emotional stimulation, which is like, emotional and motivational nitrous oxide, right? Continuously recalibrating your capabilities and adjusting to new complexities maintains intellectual vitality and emotional engagement, which is an antidote to the monotony of routine and performance. But on the other hand, the attractiveness of these kinds of benefits, like strengthening your self-belief and discovering those uncharted capabilities and the intellectual and emotional stimulation, these rewards can sometimes obscure genuine psychological costs to engaging in existential risk that have to be reckoned with. Like, for example, emotional instability, which is that when you're engaging in those limit situations, the intense oscillation between challenge and success, between anxiety and euphoria, and that can wear you down emotionally, resulting in a psychological exhaustion. Also, when you engage in existential risk, you can have the anxiety of fragmentation, which is constantly redefining personal boundaries, challenges your self-image. And it almost to the point of risking an internal fragmentation of identity that can be deeply unsettling. And it can be a challenge to your mental health. And then finally, the erosion of reflective capacity. So that when you're putting yourself as often as possible in these limit situations, then that persistent urgency to recalibrate decisions and strategies under pressure can lead to a gradual erosion of the capacity for intuitive and reflective and nuanced decision making. So our approach would be something like strategic oscillation, which is more of a realistic approach. And sustaining high performance while actively confronting existential risk requires a deliberate management rather than a simple exertion of willpower. We've mentioned this concept before. We're drawing from insights from a school of thought called polarity management. And one effective strategy involves that consciously planned oscillation between existential push and psychological reintegration. So you've got a few dynamics here. You've got periods of intensity and rest, where we're structuring distinct phases in which one intentionally pushes into existential risk, balanced by equally intentional periods of lower stakes activity designed for psychological consolidation and rest. So you've got periods of intensity and rest. You've also got metacognitive mapping. This is regularly assessing that your psychological state and your existential exposure serves as an internal audit, and then offering insights into when limits have been sufficiently tested and when you have to pull back from those limits and when reintegration is essential. So you've got that periods of intensity and rest. You've got metacognitive mapping. You've also got existential anchoring. This is actually huge. This is where you're keeping the explicit, vivid reminders of core personal values. And I'm going to do a video series on developing your own personal value system. because that's huge. That's a core primitive for me in my philosophy. And there is no resource I know of about how to do that. But you have to keep those explicit reminders that bring up vivid motivational phenomena within your body that are connected to those core personal values you have. And those enduring aspects of identity have to be kept readily accessible during high risk phases to provide a tangible anchor. So, for example, like those nostalgic moments or those childhood moments or those future dreams that ground you and say, this is how I'm doing this. This is why I'm doing this. That broader story has to frame what you're doing when things feel high risk. So instead of having your grounding and your anchoring and your stability in the now and the zoomed in, you have to have your grounding and your stability and your anchoring in the zoomed out. And this practice, this existential anchoring, grounding yourself in the zoomed out perspective, this practice really helps to mitigate the risk of psychological drift. And it ensures that boundary testing doesn't devolve into disorienting fragmentation of your identity and yourself, right? So what does a real world version of this look like? So like a really common story here is where you've got most entrepreneurs or ambitious professionals, right? Where they have a period of rapid growth that arrives, and it's defined by really long work days and constant problem solving and perpetual uncertainty. And it's initially exhilarating. And the situation gradually reveals more complicated emotional landscapes. And that initial sense of mastery and emotional elicitation begins to fade, and it's replaced by this creeping anxiety. Decisions that you previously made confidently now feel a little bit shaky. And you might find yourself waking up in the night and consumed by questions about your own capability and your purpose. And am I an imposter? And is this worth it? And what should I do next? And what am I even doing? Right? And in this scenario, existential risk reveals itself very vividly, where the rewards, which were like initially clear and compelling, like I'm going to take this job, I'm not sure fully what I'm doing, or I'm going to start this business, I'm not sure I fully know how to do that, right? Like the rewards begin to diminish under the accumulating psychological toll, right? You've got the initial peak, and then you've got what Seth Godin calls the dip, where you're like, oh no, right? The excitement and the allure wears off, and all that's left is the emotional risk. And that individual faces a genuine limit situation where they're like, listen, I bet it all on black and I lost, and I've only got these few chips left. It's not that you lost, it's that you just don't, you like the verdict hasn't come in yet. And you're like, I don't know if I'm winning or losing. I don't know if I'm winning or losing. And the truth is you haven't yet, right? You've got your own success is like a Schrodinger's cat situation. You're like, is it dead or is it alive? Kind of both. And that the anxiety of it being both is it feels unbearable, right? The individual faces a genuine limit situation. You persist in the gamble or you retreat into safety. This moment is critical because retreat does not always mean failure, and nor does persistence guarantee growth. Instead, a deliberate recalibration is always required, where you're strategically pulling back to reassess your identity, your core motivations, and your resilience. And then you're also doubling down based on that in practices of discipline that allow you to move forward without thinking too much. So here, really high performance is sustained not by relentless forward momentum, but by that skillful negotiation between existential risk and psychological stability. So when you're wobbling on the motorcycle, right, existentially in these seasons of pushing your limits, and people are telling you this is unsustainable, you're going to burn out, you can't be doing this, and you're like, this is a goal that's really meaningful to me, and I'm pursuing it. And right now, I'm the only person that's encouraging me to continue to do this. And I don't know if that means that I'm crazy and stupid, or that I just don't. People in my life just don't understand my value system and aren't don't see things the way that I see them. Like, which is it? Like, am I wrong or am I right? Should I keep going or should I not? Right? And that's a genuine question you have to answer for yourself. And if you keep going, there is a sense in which you have to kind of ignore the voice of your family and friends. And most successful people in life have had a moment where they've had to do that. And the first few times you do that, it can feel really lonely, and you can kind of feel stupid, and it can feel extra risky. And the thing is, sometimes they're right. Sometimes you shouldn't be engaging in risk. Sometimes that like entrepreneur, go after it, pursue your dreams messaging isn't right for you in this exact moment of your life. And I've had moments of my life where what I needed was to pull back and rebuild in my stability and achieve reintegration. And what I did was I doubled down on the mindset of risk. And it was the wrong move at the time. And I'm not saying I didn't learn anything from it or I regret it. It's just strategically wasn't the ideal move to make at the time. So making these decisions, remember, it's not all or nothing. It's not, do I go for it or do I not? It's about having a process of knowing when you're in a boundary situation and doing the best you can to do an internal audit and say, is this a moment I need to listen to myself, or is this a moment I need to retreat a bit and reintegrate and then go back and push the boundary again? So just to wrap up, high performance living, or the intent or desire or motivation or aim to live in a high performance way, consciously pursued at the edge of one's perceived capabilities, is not a simple growth exercise, nor is it merely a prelude to inevitable burnout. Instead, it is a pretty sophisticated existential wager where you're embracing substantial rewards and significant risks. And by acknowledging and explicitly managing these risks, individuals can cultivate a deeper form of growth, one that integrates self-discovery and emotional complexity and authentic resilience. And operating beyond your limits is therefore not really an act of ambition alone. It's a profound act of existential courage, continuously refining the boundary between possibility and identity.